Tension is running high between Iraq and Kuwait over the invasion and war of almost 2 decades ago. But why, even with Saddam's demise, do Kuwaitis insist on maintaining sanctions against Iraq and claiming billions of dollars in damages? Can it be just about money? Kuwait, Iraq, and the legacy of Desert Storm. This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm Kamahl Santmaria. As we all know, Iraq was invaded in 2003 and the effects are still being felt. But those with longer memories will recall Kuwait was invaded some 13 years earlier by Iraq. And as we're about to discuss, the effects are still being felt. That is because the issue of war reparations, damages if you will, has reared its head again. A, because the UN's about to review the reparations scheme, and B, because Kuwait's still demanding tens of billions of dollars in compensation for being invaded by Saddam Hussein. But of course Saddam's gone now, leaving the question, should Iraq in 2009 be paying for the actions of a very different Iraq back in 1990? Our discussion in a moment, after this report from Hashim Al-Barra.
Kuwait's foreign minister during a landmark visit to Baghdad a few months ago, the first in 17 years. While Iraqi and Kuwaiti officials publicly spoke about the positive aspects of bilateral relations, behind the scene a lingering tension about the past. The Kuwaitis are asking Iraq to pay billions of dollars in reparations for Saddam Hussein's invasion of the oil-rich country in 1990. Iraq is currently committed to pay 5% of its oil revenues to Kuwait under the United Nations Compensation Commission scheme. Iraq is also banned by the UN Charter's Chapter 7. This deals with sanctions, restrictions on arms buying and selling, and the freezing of financial assets abroad. Chapter 7 also gives the United Nations Security Council a mandate to use force against Iraq if it is deemed a threat to international peace and security. Baghdad has itself been lobbying for the lifting of sanctions. It argues that the current Iraqi government has also been a victim of Saddam's atrocities, and that reparations should have been written off when he was overthrown in 2003. The United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said during a recent visit to Baghdad that the UN is considering the lifting of the sanctions. But the Kuwaitis are rejecting any concessions. They say Iraq must first properly acknowledge land and maritime borders, return property stolen during the invasion, and be held accountable for Kuwaitis who disappeared in 1990. For their part, some Iraqi MPs are threatening to counter-sue Kuwait for being the main platform for the 2003 invasion of their country. They too are asking for billions of dollars in compensation. With a compromise unlikely, the spat shows no sign of abating nearly 20 years after Kuwait was invaded. Hashim Al-Barra, Inside Story.
All right, let's bring in our guests for today. Sami al-faraj, he is the president of the Kuwait Center of Strategic Studies. He is in Kuwait City. And in London is Justin Alexander. He is the Middle East editor at the Economist Intelligence Unit. He has also worked with the UN Assistance Mission on Iraq. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. Sami al-faraj, I'll start with you in Kuwait City. I guess we have to be fair and say that a deal is a deal. This was done under the United Nations. It has been adhered to. But the question is, and I asked this before, why should Iraq now be made to pay for what Iraq, a very, very different Iraq, in 1990 did?
Well, just like the government of Konrad Adenauer paid for the ill inflicted by the regime of Hitler upon the Jews and other nations. This is a concept, a principle, a cardinal principle of international law and international relations among civilized nations. It's called succession of states. That is to say, the government of today is responsible for whatever happened during the reign of the government of yesterday. And it also is entitled to the rights of the government of yesterday too. If Iraq were to have rights in Kuwait today, the government of today in Iraq can claim the rights that were basically negotiated for by the older regime. It's a question, the United Nations resolutions are not resolutions negotiated on void. They are negotiated on a legal basis. The negotiations are between the phrasing of the resolution itself, but it has to have a strong grounding in international law.
You use the phrase, though, and I think it's an interesting one, succession of states. In Iraq, though, it was hardly succession, though. It was an invasion, a regime was toppled by force, and if anyone should know about invasions as well, it's Kuwait.
Yes, of course. Whatever the Iraqis are saying has really evaporated the moment they put the older regime on the dock and they tried them. The moment they did that, they actually solidified the fact that the older regime was basically unjust and it should not have ruled Iraq. And therefore, today the older regime is in full demise. The Iraqis benefited, the new regime benefited from that fact. Now, none of them, not a single person of the current Iraqi regime today could have been in his or her position without the so-called occupation. Let's not forget that whatever intervention happened in 2003, it had been sanctified post facto by the UN. The fact then, as the third step happened also, when the Iraqi government, as a sovereign state, negotiated with the greatest interventionary power, which is the United States, last December, at the time when the United Resolution was going to expire. And therefore, the mechanism by which the Iraqis gave force to such so-called illegitimate occupation basically make this case really void and not possible to really hold in a court of law.
Okay, then. I just want to, for our viewers and for you as well, for our guests, just to recap the numbers. The United Nations deal, which Sami's been talking about, demanded Iraq pay $53 billion in war reparations. The money would come from its oil sales. Kuwait's allocation, by far the biggest it is as well, $37 billion was its allocation. But Kuwait is still claiming it is owed $25.5 billion some 18 years later. Let's bring Justin Alexander into the conversation now. And I want to ask you, it's kind of a moral question as well. And when there's $25 billion involved, I'm not sure where morals come into it. But the moral question I've got is that Kuwait is hardly the sort of country that needs $25 billion. Iraq definitely needs $25 billion to try to rebuild it after 6 years of war.
That's a fair point, Kamahl. If you look at the numbers, this year Iraq is going to face a massive budget deficit, something like $17 billion, whereas Kuwait will have a surplus. And Kuwait has foreign assets which are roughly around, they're unclear, but over $200 billion. So Kuwait has assets which are more than 8 times the amount of reparations it's claiming from Iraq. So the economics of it are quite slanted. But this issue, it confuses a number of things. It confuses the bilateral relations between Iraq and Kuwait, which are very important and need to be good and strong for the interests of both countries, and the relations between Iraq and the United Nations. And under the current system, under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, these two are being confused. For Kuwait, that's beneficial because the United Nations provides a kind of a guarantee for the payment of reparations. But also, it makes it difficult for, firstly, Iraq to function in a normal way in the international community, and also to have normal bilateral relations with Kuwait.
So, Sami al-Faraj, if I come back to you, is this not about money then? As I said, Kuwait is hardly the country in the Gulf which needs any money. Is this not about the money then?
It is not about the money, because we have had, toyed with solutions since 1991. We need admission from Iraq of the, legitimacy of that fund, of that money, first of all. Second is that to the willingness to pay the debts. But most importantly is the fate of our missing persons and our documents which represent our history. The Iraqis have withheld such issues, those two issues, non-financial issues, on the ground that they could be, you know, trump card in negotiations with Kuwait. The other thing is the pursuit of the subject today is the same pursuit of the Iraqi regime subject after the invasion of Kuwait, and that is that, you know, the negotiations should be bilateral and not under the umbrella of the United Nations. We stick to the umbrella of the United Nations because of the ratio of forces. The third thing is that, you know, we miss that Iraq today is truly in dire need of money, but the former Speaker of the Iraqi Parliament actually put together a figure that was $250 billion in embezzlement, and there are around tens of thousands in Iraq today accused by Iraqi institutions and court of embezzlement. This money has also gone away. It could have been you know, contributory to any plans Iraq developed for itself to become a healthy economy again. So it's not just the question of Kuwait. A fourth element in the Kuwaiti perception is that, you know, we have this image of Iraq, whether imagery image or real, and that is Iran controls Iraq. And so the perception in the street is that, you know, they wanted us to cancel our reparation, but then tomorrow they will not be able to cancel the reparation to Iran, and Iran will get its reparation. So the question, a fifth element for us is that, you know, we have to jump over this bilateral political debate and look at the concrete things upon which we can build a healthy relationship. That is to say that, you know, the two development plans of the two nations can really tie together and start together, or being restarted together. We need things from them and they need things from us. And why not start that and forget about talking about money per se?
Okay.
Because at the start of, I just finished one word.
Sure.
At the start of such joint, you know, ventures, the money will come from Kuwait. We are not going to wait for them to bring the money from reparations. No, we will put the money for the joint projects. We were the first to establish a bank for the reconstruction of Iraq. That was in 2003, end of 2003, beginning of 2004. So this thing today, the presentation of the case, makes it as if we don't need the money, but we want to hassle the Iraqis, which is not true.
Justin Alexander, I'm interested in the stance of the other Gulf states, the GCC as we call them. They met on the 8th of June, they held an emergency meeting and they decided to throw their full support behind Kuwait in this endeavour. Why is what I'm trying to understand. When you think that other Gulf states have already cancelled their debt, I think the UAE cancelled about $7 billion worth of debt to Iraq, why then throw all the support behind Kuwait?
This is nothing new. The Gulf countries have stood together in their demands for reparation and also debt payment, which is a separate issue. And so this is nothing new. It's to be expected. You mentioned the UAE, and that really led the way last July when it unilaterally wrote off the $7 billion of debt it had been claiming. And as well as the reparation claims, Kuwait is also claiming about $16 billion of debt. Saudi Arabia also has very large debt claims in the region of $20+ billion. So it would be very positive in terms of supporting Iraq and developing a good relation between Iraq and the Gulf if Kuwait and Saudi Arabia followed the example of the UAE and, quite apart from the issue of reparations, cancel these debt claims, because the debt relates to money which was provided to Saddam's government in the 1980s to fight the Iran-Iraq war. And there's a clear case that is illegitimate. Even if the reparations themselves have a solid legal basis, the debt doesn't.
Let's bring in another element now, the United States, because as the latest talks began, the US ambassador to Iraq said the United States supported moves to build political and economic relations between Iraq and Kuwait. And some say this feud can't actually be resolved without some sort of US involvement. It was the US-led intervention in the first Gulf War that forced Saddam Hussein's army out of Kuwait in the first place. And while Iraq is asking Kuwait to drop the sanctions against it, some Iraqi members of parliament, and this is interesting, they're demanding the situation be reversed, that Kuwait compensate Iraq for allowing a foreign army in 2003, namely the United States, to use it as a base to invade Iraq. And then on top of that, someone suggested the United States should pay compensation to Iraq for the 2003 invasion and even for the economic sanctions imposed during Saddam Hussein's rule. It's all a little bit complicated, to be perfectly honest. Let's go back to Justin Alexander. First of all, this talk of Iraq, the reverse, as I said, Iraq seeking damages from Kuwait over 2003. Any chance of that, do you think?
There's no chance that will actually be paid. There are reparations and counter-reparation claims throughout the region for all the wars that have gone on, and this is to be expected. The only reason that Kuwait was allocated reparations was because Iraq was defeated by the international force in 1990, and the reparation payments were enforced on it. There's no mechanism whereby Iraq could, even if it had a justified case against Kuwait or more likely against the United States for compensation payments, there's no way that could be enforced. But what this issue does point out is that this is a real can of worms, and bilateral relations between Iraq, the US, Kuwait and other countries should be conducted on a normal basis rather than focusing on these claims for damages.
That's a very good point, which I'm going to put to Sami al-Faraj. Good relations between these two countries is what everyone, the US, I think the whole international community wants. But as Justin just said there, it's hinging on this money at the moment. It doesn't put out a good face that it's all about money, really. Why not actually focus on the relations solely and leave this money issue behind?
We have, actually. If you look at the Kuwaiti strategic vision of 1998, Iraq enjoys the focus in this. That is to say that if we were to build a new Kuwait, it has to really take into consideration the security of Iran and Iraq and Saudi Arabia. And because of the closeness to Iraq, Iraq is part and parcel of our strategic outlook for the next 20 years. Actually, we are going to invest in this project more than what we are claiming from Iraq in reparation. Also, this money is our money, not from the reparation. It does not rely on the payment of reparation. A third thing is that we are calling for joint ventures with the Iraqis. The Iraqis do not want to do any concessions with regard to ventures, with regard to banking operations, with regard to so many things, whether it's small businesses or large businesses. Iraq just wants somebody to cancel what they owe to others. The third thing is that for this part of the world, it is just like somebody with a credit card. When you borrow and pay, you establish a record. Then you are really kosher to be dealt with. And now Iraq is a state sitting and asking everybody just to forgive its debt. Now, with regard to the position of the GCC as one and the position of the other nations, the GCC took a more active support for the Iraqi government since the Madrid conference. It's not just Kuwait, it is also the other GCC nations.
Mr. Sami, I'm just going to interrupt you. I'm sorry, because I'm pleased to say we've managed to make connection with Baghdad, a guest in Baghdad who's going to join us for the end of the show here. It's Saad al-Mutalibbi. He's from the Iraqi government reconciliation team. I'm not sure how much you've heard of our discussion until now, but certainly what Sami al-Faraj has been saying in Kuwait City is that there is a money issue here, but that Kuwait wants to put the money back into Baghdad. It wants to make joint ventures. It wants to help Iraq out. What do you say to that?
First of all, I didn't hear any of the arguments really happening, but if it's a matter of money, I could assure on behalf of the Iraq government that Iraq government would like to hold this issue in bilateral negotiations with Kuwait, and there is no issue of forgiving. Nobody has done anything wrong. I mean, this government hasn't done anything wrong to Kuwait to ask for forgiveness. The issue is that there are matters, bilateral matters, that should be discussed between the two countries. And politics today work for the interest of economy, as we all know. We need to prosper our two nations. And there is no question of entering into a further conflict or a new conflict with any of our neighboring countries. The
bottom
issue
line,
here
though, will Baghdad pay the money?
Well, Baghdad is paying the money. Is paying the money now, and there is no question of us holding back any money, but there are many issues that needs to be discussed between the two countries in a cordial, in a brotherly way. And again, throwing all this into the media, forth and pro, I mean, this will not resolve any issues. If the Kuwaitis have any reservations on any issue and dealing with Iraq, well, tell us directly. Send a delegation, come and speak your mind, speak any issue that you hold against Iraq. And you will see there will only be welcoming arms and a welcome and open minds, ready to hear what you have to say. It's not in your interest, it's not in our interest, it's in nobody's interest to escalate tension between the two countries. We need to quiet down these issues, and of course there are the issues of the border, there's the issues of the prisoners of war, the Kuwaiti prisoners there were in Iraq. And after all, Iraq and Kuwait, we both suffered from the same dictator. You suffered, the Kuwaitis suffered, we suffered for 35 years, and we are still suffering today from the remnants of that regime.
So do you accept the argument? Sorry to interrupt you. Do you accept the argument then, and this was one that was put by Sami al-Faraj a little bit earlier, that the current Iraqi government, he called it a succession of states, that this government simply inherited the problems of the last government and that everyone's willing to go along with that?
Well, we inherited the whole mess out of Saddam Hussein. It's not this government, it's not the new government, not the democratically elected governments of Iraq that caused any of these issues. This is a matter that we inherited, we and the Kuwaitis inherited this issue from Saddam Hussein and his ghastly regime. The issue is, how do we deal with it in a proper political manner? And we are ready to resolve this issue. There is no nobody's asking for any extra efforts from the Kuwaitis. Well, we can ask this from our American friends, from the Russians, from the Chinese, from everybody else, but we don't expect this kind of help from our Arab brothers.
And speaking of the US, would you expect or would you want them to step in any way? Because there is talk, and it came from the top of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, of scrapping the reparations deal, which I guess on paper at least would be advantageous to Iraq, but could stoke tensions even further. Would you need outside help if that were to happen?
We don't need an outside help, but as you know, we have a strategic agreement with the United States, and the United States is held by this agreement to assist Iraq in removing, getting Iraq out of Clause 7 of the Security Council. The issue is that if we get out or if we don't get out, the negotiations, we would like to hold all these negotiations directly with the state of Kuwait, where we could resolve these issues directly with Kuwait and pay any monies that are due. And there is no question about not wanting to pay the money. This is ridiculous. People who think that Iraq wants to get out of its previous commitments, this is completely absurd.
Quick final thought just from Justin Alexander in London. I'm just running out of time on the show, but I just wanted that point about the reparations scheme being scrapped. It is a possibility, or at least being reduced. In your view, just briefly, what would happen then? Would that further stoke tension?
All that could happen is that the reparations could be moved from the United Nations mandate and switched to a bilateral mandate between Iraq and Kuwait, and then it would be up to those two countries to decide both on the amount that's repaid and, critically, the rate of repayment, which is currently 5% of Iraq's oil revenues. Now, if that was to happen, then firstly, Iraq could relate better to the UN. It would no longer be under Chapter 7, and it could deal with this issue of reparations and also the other issues such as borders and prisoners with Kuwait on a normal bilateral basis. And I think this is what the Iraqi representative was saying. And I believe if that were to happen, that would be beneficial for Kuwait as well.
Gentlemen, we're going to leave it there. I'm sorry about the technical problems, but I think we've very much heard all your thoughts, and I want to thank all of you. That was Saad al-Mutalibbi from the Iraqi government there in Baghdad, Sami al-Faraj from the Kuwaiti Centre of Strategic Studies, and Justin Alexander from The Economist magazine. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. And to you, our viewers, thanks for joining us here on Inside Story. You can send comments on this show or a suggestion for a future show to our email address, which is, of course, insidestory@aljazeera.net. From the whole team, though, it's goodbye for now.